Today I will show you something really cool. 3 top stitch seams that you will simply fall in love with. While top stitching is considered a decorative stitch, for me it is one of the most functional, durable applications in sewing, especially if you sew at home. Using top stitching as a tool to keep seam allowance layers flat and smooth will result in a durable seam that truly withstands the garment's life cycle and regular machine washing. A top stitch seam is, for the most part, decorative in nature. In many instances, however, it does also offer significant functionality. Top stitching is applied on the fabric surface and is always visible on the face of the garment. Conventionally, top stitching is applied either on both or a single side of the seam, catching the seam allowance layers underneath. This type of surface stitching can be used to visually isolate a seam line and provide visual interest to the garment overall. While mostly aesthetic in its purpose, top stitching can also be used to permanently keep seam allowances pointing in a desired direction. It conveniently also adds an extra layer of durability to a seam. Given that top stitching is usually added in relation to a seam, the seam line provides a convenient guide in the sewing process. To sew a welt seam, start by sewing a regular seam following conventional seam stitching rules. Decide which side of the seam line you'd like to place the top stitching. Iron the seam with the seam allowance positioned in this direction. You will find that ironing the seam allowance in a single direction is easiest to achieve from the face of the garment. Trim the seam allowance layer located underneath to about 1/4 of an inch or half the seam allowance width. Clean finish the top seam allowance layer with an overedge stitch or any other method appropriate for your fabric. From the right side of the garment, insert a few pins horizontally along the seam, catching the seam allowance layers underneath. At this point, you can use masking tape or a simple hand basting stitch to mark the top stitch line directly on the fabric surface. If using a basting stitch, remove the pins as they will no longer be needed. Working on the face side, top stitch along the seam line, catching the seam allowance layers underneath. Keep your top stitching as evenly positioned from the seam as you can. To complete, press the finished top stitched seam in the direction the stitching was applied. To top stitch on both sides of the seam line, start by sewing a seam following standard seam stitching rules, face sides touching, and following the designated seam allowance. Clean finish each seam allowance edge individually. For a fast, effective finish, use a zigzag or an overlock stitch. Press the stitch in the direction it was applied, then iron the seam with the seam allowance open as shown. Iron on the wrong side of the seam first, then on the face of the seam again to flatten it. If you do not feel comfortable with your sewing machine yet, use masking tape at the desired top stitch location. From the face of the garment, insert a few pins perpendicular to the seam line through the garment and seam allowance layers underneath. Working from the face of the seam, stitch at the desired distance from the seam line on each side, catching the seam allowance layers underneath as you stitch. Stitch right next to the edge of the masking tape, gently remove it once the top stitch is complete. Press the top stitch seam in the direction the stitching was applied. A tucked seam is a little different than a regular top stitch seam, as it skips the step of actually sewing the seam prior to top stitching. Instead, the fabric is simply folded and directly top stitched through all layers of the garment and seam allowance underneath. To start with, fold one of the seam edges down its seam line. Iron this fold to crease the fold line. Place the folded piece on top of the other seam edge, matching the fold to the other edge's seam line. It helps in this case to have the seam lines transferred onto each fabric piece. You can also use a gauge pointer or ruler to find the seam lines if they have not already been marked. Insert a few pins to keep the folded layers properly aligned to its corresponding seam line. Hand baste the layers down the middle as shown. To complete the tuck seam, top stitch about 1/4 of an inch away from the folded edge through all layers of the garment and seam allowance underneath. Press the final top stitch in the direction it was stitched.